Sometimes I take a body pattern that I have and I redesign it for any number of reasons. We won't go into all of that right now. But I did that just a few weeks ago um, with this pattern here. This is what I refer to as my MJ pattern. Uh, Mini Jumbo is what that stands for. And I did that pattern out of 1/8 inch acrylic, white happens to be, because this is what I happen to have. Um, and then I decided, I think I'm going to use my rim bender to bend rims, so I needed to replace this body bending form to match this, except I need it slightly smaller. Well, I had to go through a couple of steps that if you were to do this, hopefully you wouldn't need to, but I'll kind of explain my way through. This pattern, being as thin as it is, does not give me a very durable edge, nor does it give me much wiggle room when it comes to following this with a router or a shaper or a router table. So if you were going to design a pattern, you may have to do the same thing, and that is make a copy of this in something thicker. Or you could just make your pattern thicker. Maybe if you did this in 1/4 inch acrylic or polycarbonate, something like that, or a good 1/4 inch dense material, you could eliminate this step of matching these two exactly. But that's done, of course, by cutting this out just oversized at a bandsaw, and then lining these two up, double face taping these together, and then following around with a flush trim bit like this, or here's a 1/2 inch. I'm sure many of you are familiar with all of this, but they both do the same thing. The spiral, of course, with a lot more finesse than the straight cutter. But I had to make that copy because this, as I mentioned, is not durable enough. But now I want to make a copy of this so that I can end up with this, but it needs to be smaller than this by a 1/16 of an inch. And I'll explain why I selected a 1/16 of an inch as I go along, but you could vary that any way you want to if you have the technology available to you to do that. So what I did was I just took this pattern, which I remade, and I took some 3/4 inch plywood, which I'm going to use for my pattern, and I roughed it out on the bandsaw. And you just trace that out and take it over to the bandsaw and whack away at it. Simple enough. But then, how do you make it a 1/16 of an inch smaller? And here's what I did. Maybe you could do the same thing. Taking my pattern, of course, and I'm going to screw it right down. I'm not even going to use double face tape because I don't trust it that well. I'm going to screw this thing down in 3 or 4 places so that this now becomes my pattern for a 0 clearance bit to ride against. Oh, I said 0 clearance bit. You're thinking, well, how are you going to make this smaller? And here comes the tasty. Well, here's where the trickery comes in, so to speak. How do I make this only smaller than the original? As you know, a 0 clearance bit or a flush trim bit has a bearing that is exactly the same size as the cutting diameter. So that means that I have to make a bearing that is smaller than the cutting diameter that I'm working with. Well, there are available. I don't know where you would find these at the moment. I've had this for probably 25 years. This is a whole set of bearings and retainer rings and so on that you can put over router shanks. I don't know if these are still available, but I can tell you that at least for these rabbiting cutters like these, those bearings, if you have a rabbiting cutter, are very handy. I can't use a rabbiting cutter to do what I'm going to do because a rabbiting cutter is generally only 1/2 inch deep and I need 3/4 of an inch or more. But you might be able to employ those bearings. The idea is, the trick is that you need to identify a bearing that will slip over your router bit shank that represents the difference in thickness that you want. This is a 1-inch bit, and if this happens to be a 7/8 bearing, then I'm in business. I just slip a collar over that, and with an Allen wrench, tighten that down, and now the bearing stays in place and the bit can be used. Well, I didn't have exactly what I needed for this purpose, so what I did is over at the shaper, and I'll show you that as soon as we go over there. But the whole idea is, of course, to match a bearing that is undersized by the amount needed. Now, with 1/4-inch bits, that might be a little bit harder to do because you have to have a bit that is clearly much larger than the shank. And of course, the less that difference is, this is a 1/4-inch shank, 1/2-inch bit. The less that difference is, the harder it's going to be to find a bearing that has a race that's that small. So if you're working 1/4-inch bits, it could be a challenge, but I think it could be done if you have the right ones. And of course, you'd want to feed slowly with a 1/4-inch shank bit. Another consideration is you want to have enough shaft length on your router bit so that once you get a bearing and a stop collar on there, you've got enough to get down into that chuck fully so that you're not going to have any whip or wandering of any kind. You want to make sure you've got a good stable connection between your router and your bit. So now let's go over to the shaper and I'll show you how I've got this rigged up. So what I did was I started with a 1-inch straight bit, 1/2-inch shank, and I put a bearing on it in here that is, of course, 1/2-inch inside diameter and 3/4 inch outside diameter, but that wasn't quite enough. So to get the actual difference I needed, I couldn't find a proper bearing to give me that 1/16 inch difference. So what I did was took a piece of nylon rod and I bored it to fit that bearing, and I turned the outside diameter so that what I ended up with was a 1/16 of an inch difference. So this outside here is just 7/8 of an inch. Now you might be able to find a bearing, or you may be able to buy a kit that would have that in it. I'm not sure. Probably if you went through the bearings in one of those rabbiting sets, you'd find that. And I probably should have looked before I made all of this up, but I did this a while ago, so we'll just try it. So of course, the principle is always the same. The bearing is going to read the pattern, which is right here on top. For now, it's going to be like so when we make the cut. And the cutter will then reshape this upper piece so that it's a 1/16 of an inch smaller. I'm going to move the camera back. I will show you this operation, or at least part of it. So I'll just show you a little bit of this so you can see how it goes. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. One thing I do want to mention is I have a starting pin out here. I like to put a starting pin in position because that helps you hold your work against the force of the bit trying to pull it out of your hands. And of course, this is not a safety demonstration, but just fair warning. You keep your hands out of this, because if you don't, this doesn't cut you, it just turns you into hamburger. So the result is we have the pattern here, the workpiece over here, precisely a 1/16 of an inch smaller all the way around. Just that simple. So I'm done with my operation, so I took the bit out of the shaper, and I thought I'd just show you a closer look at this. You know, it's a simple bit with a stop collar on it and this bearing right here, but with that nylon bushing that I made. Now, admittedly, if you were to make bushings like this, you're going to need a metal lathe. I don't know of any other way to do that. See, I've made bunches of these. Here's one in aluminum for a different purpose. I don't even recall what the purpose was, but this slips on there with a pretty good tight fit, and I think this one leaves me with a I don't know, 30 thousandths difference or something. I don't remember what I was after, but it's all very doable. But I think with the standard bearings that you can find with rabbiting sets and so on, you could come up with these configurations probably to get pretty close to whatever you wanted. So there's the completed halves for the form, all set, 1/16 of an inch smaller than the original. As I was filming this, I thought, gee, what's the appropriate title for this? I think it might be How to Make Exactly the Same Thing, Only Different. Beyond that, I'm not sure. At any rate, I'm Kevin Ledoux, the Pragmatic Luther. I hope you got something out of this video, and I will be back again when I can think up some other crazy content to bring in.